In this episode, we bring together several ideas that beginners often learn in separate pieces and show why they work much better when they are understood as parts of one connected story. Many people first study cybersecurity by looking at controls on one day, metrics on another day, threats in another chapter, and response somewhere near the end. But real security work does not happen in those neat categories. A control is chosen because a threat exists. A metric is collected because someone wants to know whether the control is helping, and response becomes necessary when the control, the metric, or the understanding of the threat was not strong enough to stop harm in time. Once you see those links clearly, the field becomes much easier to follow. Security stops feeling like a long list of unrelated tasks and starts feeling like a cycle of protection, observation, interpretation, and action that helps an organization protect what matters while learning from what it sees. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is with the idea of a control, because controls are often the most visible part of security to people who are new to the field. A control is anything the organization puts in place to reduce risk, limit misuse, improve visibility, or strengthen decision-making around important systems and data. Some controls are technical, such as access restrictions, logging, encryption, or monitoring tools. Some are administrative, such as policies, approvals, training, and defined procedures. Some are physical, such as badges, locked spaces, and visitor processes. The important point is that a control is not valuable just because it exists. It is valuable because it is meant to address a real concern. That is why controls should never be chosen in isolation from the problems they are supposed to reduce. If an organization forgets that connection, it can end up with a large number of controls that look impressive in a list but do not clearly reduce the threats that matter most. Threats provide the reason the story exists at all, because without a threat, there would be no need to design controls or measure whether they work. A threat can come from an attacker, an insider, a careless user, an operational mistake, a weak process, a failing system, or any other source of potential harm to the organization's data, systems, services, or trust. The threat does not need to be dramatic to matter. It may be something as ordinary as overbroad access, weak configuration, poor asset visibility, or slow detection of suspicious behavior. What matters is that the organization understands what kind of harm is possible, what assets are involved, and what conditions make that harm more likely. When threats are understood clearly, controls can be chosen with purpose. When threats are vague or treated as background noise, controls often become generic. That leads to a weak story where the organization may be working hard, but not always in the places where its effort would reduce the greatest amount of real risk. Metrics enter the story because security teams need a way to know whether their decisions are helping, whether their visibility is improving, and whether their controls are supporting the outcomes the organization actually cares about. A metric is simply a measured piece of information used to understand performance, condition, or change over time. In security, metrics can describe many things. They can show how quickly suspicious activity is detected, how often certain controls are bypassed, how many assets remain unsupported, how long it takes to remove unneeded access, or how many important systems are covered by meaningful logging. For a beginner, the main point is that metrics are not there to decorate presentations or make security look more scientific than it is. They are there to help the organization ask whether controls are functioning in a way that changes risk for the better. If the metric does not help answer that question, it may be interesting, but it is probably not central to the story. This is why a weak security program often has a mismatch between controls and metrics. It may count easy things simply because those things are easy to count, while failing to measure whether the counted activity leads to better protection. For example, a team may report how many awareness emails were sent, how many tools were installed, or how many alerts were generated. Yet those numbers alone do not tell you whether the organization is safer. Sending more messages does not prove users make better decisions. Installing more tools does not prove visibility improved. Generating more alerts does not prove the right threats are being noticed in time. A stronger program asks harder questions. Did risky access shrink? Did meaningful detection improve? Did important assets become more visible? Did response become faster or more accurate? And did fewer serious issues reach the point of business harm? Those questions connect the metric back to the control and the threat, which is exactly what makes the story coherent instead of merely busy. Another reason this connection matters is that controls are not all meant to do the same job. Some are preventive, which means they are meant to reduce the chance that harmful behavior succeeds in the first place. Some are detective, which means they are designed to reveal when something suspicious or harmful may already be happening. Some are corrective or responsive, which means they help contain damage, restore trust, or prevent recurrence after an event has already begun. Metrics should reflect those differences. A preventive control may need metrics that show whether access is limited appropriately or whether insecure configurations are decreasing over time. A detective control may need metrics that show coverage, signal quality, and how quickly meaningful patterns are identified. A responsive control may need metrics tied to containment, recovery, and the quality of follow-through after an event. When beginners understand that controls have different purposes, they are much less likely to assume that all metrics should look the same or that one number can tell the whole security story by itself. This brings us to the role of response, which is where the story becomes especially real. Response is what happens when a threat becomes active enough, visible enough, or damaging enough that the organization must shift from ordinary monitoring into organized action. Response matters because no set of controls is perfect, no visibility is complete, and no environment is so stable that every problem can be prevented in advance. What response reveals, however, is whether the earlier parts of the story were strong. If a team responds quickly, understands what is happening, limits the damage, and recovers in a controlled way, that often means controls, metrics, and threat understanding were aligned well enough to support useful action. If the team responds slowly, argues about the meaning of the event, or discovers that nobody really knows what the controls were supposed to prevent, that suggests the story was broken much earlier. Response is not the separate final chapter. It is the moment when the truth of the whole security story becomes visible under pressure. A simple scenario helps make this easier to picture. Imagine an organization worried about misuse of a cloud-based document system containing sensitive planning material. The threat includes overbroad access, careless sharing, and possible use of stolen credentials by someone who should not see those files. The organization chooses controls such as stronger access rules, tighter sharing limits, meaningful logging, and review of administrative changes. So far, that sounds reasonable, but the story becomes stronger only when metrics are attached thoughtfully. The team needs to know whether access is actually narrower than before, whether unexpected sharing is being reduced, whether logging is complete enough to reveal abnormal activity, and whether reviews of high-impact changes are happening consistently. Later, suspicious downloads appear. Now response begins, and the team can only move well if the earlier controls were real, the metrics were meaningful, and the threat had been understood clearly enough that the right activity stands out. That is what a connected security story looks like in practice. Metrics also become more useful when they are interpreted in context rather than treated as self-explanatory. A low alert count does not automatically mean security is strong. It may mean detection is weak or that important signals are being missed. A high number of blocked actions does not automatically mean controls are excellent. It may mean the environment is under frequent pressure, that users are struggling with process design, or that a misconfiguration is creating repeated noise. The same is true for response speed. A quick response is good only if the team is responding to the right thing in the right way. A very fast but poorly informed containment action can create business disruption without reducing the real problem. That is why beginners should be careful not to treat metrics as final answers. Metrics are clues that support judgment. They help people ask better questions, but they still need threat context, control knowledge, and response understanding around them to tell a meaningful story instead of a misleading one. Another important point is that different audiences in the organization need different views of the same security story. Technical teams may need detailed control metrics tied to configuration, logging quality, asset coverage, and time to detect suspicious behavior. Managers may need to understand whether the organization is improving in the areas that affect operational resilience and business risk. Leaders may need a clearer view of whether critical assets are better protected, whether major incident exposure is decreasing, and where investment or policy decisions are still needed. The story should remain connected across all those levels, even if the wording changes. If the technical team says access risk is rising, but leadership dashboards show nothing meaningful about identity weakness, then the story is broken. If response teams repeatedly struggle with one kind of threat, but control owners never see a metric that reflects that struggle, the story is broken there too. Good security communication means different views still describe the same underlying reality. This is also why governance matters so much in the background, even when the topic seems to be controls, metrics, threats, and response. Governance decides who owns the controls, who decides which threats matter most, who chooses the metrics, who reviews the results, and who has the authority to demand change when the story shows weakness. Without governance, the pieces may exist but remain disconnected. One team may operate controls, another may collect numbers, another may respond to incidents, and nobody may be responsible for asking whether the whole system is telling a consistent truth about risk. Governance gives the story accountability. It makes sure the organization does not just collect data and hold meetings, but actually learns from what it sees. For a beginner, this matters because it shows that good security is not only about doing things. It is also about making sure someone is responsible for connecting those things and turning the connection into action before the same weaknesses keep appearing in slightly different forms. A major mistake organizations make is treating response as proof that everything before it failed completely. Sometimes response does reveal deep weakness, but sometimes it reveals that earlier layers did part of their job by making the threat visible early enough for action to matter. That distinction is important. The goal is not to create a world where nothing ever happens. The goal is to create a world where threats are reduced where possible, detected meaningfully when they appear, measured in ways that support learning, and handled through response that limits harm and strengthens the environment afterward. In that sense, response should not always be viewed as evidence of defeat. It can also be evidence that the broader security story is functioning. A threat appeared, a control limited part of it, metrics helped show the pattern, and response finished the job before the damage became worse. That is not failure. That is exactly the kind of connected defense an organization wants to build. At the same time, strong security stories are honest about gaps. If a threat keeps reaching the response stage in the same way, then the organization needs to ask whether the controls are poorly chosen, whether the metrics are focused on the wrong signals, or whether the threat picture is outdated. If response teams continually discover that earlier monitoring did not provide enough context, then the metrics should probably reflect the quality of investigative visibility, not just the number of alerts. If controls look strong on paper, but incidents repeatedly show the same path of misuse, then the organization needs to reconsider whether the controls truly address the real threat or merely create the appearance of action. This is where learning becomes central. The story is not static. It should improve over time as the organization sees where controls succeed, where metrics mislead, what threats are changing, and how response experiences reveal design weaknesses that normal operations did not notice clearly enough on their own. One of the most useful habits for beginners is to start asking 4 connected questions whenever they hear a security claim. What threat is this meant to address? What control is supposed to reduce it? What metric tells us whether that control is helping? And what would response look like if the threat still got through? Those questions are simple, but they are powerful because they force the security discussion into a connected structure. If someone describes a new tool or process and cannot answer those questions clearly, the story may still be incomplete. If someone reports a metric and cannot explain which control and which threat it relates to, the number may not be as meaningful as it first appears. If someone discusses an incident but cannot connect it back to the earlier design choices around controls and visibility, the organization may miss the chance to improve. These questions help learners move from passive listening to active understanding, which is one of the biggest steps in becoming genuinely useful in security work. As we close, the main lesson is that controls, metrics, Threats and response should never be treated as separate subjects if the goal is to understand how security really works. Threats explain why the organization needs protection. Controls show what the organization is doing about those threats. Metrics reveal whether those efforts appear to be working in meaningful ways. Response shows what happens when the story is tested by real pressure, uncertainty, and possible harm. When these parts are connected clearly, security becomes much easier to understand, communicate, and improve. When they are disconnected, the organization may collect controls, numbers, and incident reports without ever seeing the larger pattern that ties them together. For a brand new learner, this final topic is important because it turns the whole course into one practical way of thinking. Security is not a pile of unrelated tasks. It is one continuous story about risk, protection, visibility, action, and learning, and the stronger that story becomes, the stronger the organization becomes with it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.